And at Airbnb, we put a lot of premium on this, right? We literally built a big knowledge management system called Knowledge Repo, which I was involved in. And among the different experimentation platforms that exist in things, I think one of the things Airbnb over-indexed on, to its credit, was having very, very standardized reporting, so that it's very easy to kind of drop in on and view any experiment from any corner of the building.
McKinsey ran this global innovation survey where 84% of executives said that innovation was important to their company's growth strategy, maybe kind of obvious, but only 6% said that they would grade themselves as satisfactory when it came to the actual performance of their innovation efforts. There's this classic dichotomy in the experimentation space. We all know it's valuable, but it's really hard to get companies at a cultural level to adopt it. So today we're going to break down 3 key obstacles that organizations face when they're trying to foster that culture of experimentation within their teams. Creating a true culture of experimentation is tough. There's deep-rooted barriers to overcome, and sometimes it's hard to generalize advice for these. It always requires the vision of a transformational leader in the organization and them building up followership over time. So in this episode, we'll do our best to provide practical advice to help overcome those challenges head on. And by the end of our discussion, you'll have some ideas or example action items to become that leader and transform your organization's approach to experimentation. Welcome back to Outperform. I'm joined as always by EPO CEO Che Sharma and Head of Statistics Engineering Sven Schmidt. Before we just jump straight into this, let's, just at a high level cover why this is an important topic, maybe why experimentation is important in the first place for businesses that are aiming to outperform their competition. The businesses who validate their ideas before they ship them are going to avoid costly mistakes. If they have a safe, inexpensive way to try big swings or risky ideas, they'll be able to innovate faster. And experimentation is going to help build institutional knowledge. It's going to help every function understand the customer and the market and move in the right direction faster. So why, if this is so obviously beneficial, is it so hard to get companies to adopt this? That's what we'll jump into today. And maybe we can just start with the stigma of failure, right? Lots of experiments, lots of things that we try don't pan out, and that can be hard to accept. So if experimentation is, so obviously beneficial and there's so many ways that can give us an advantage, why is it so hard to get people to adopt this? This is where we can jump into these challenges in creating a culture of experimentation. And maybe the place to start is just with the stigma of failure. Lots of things that we try aren't going to work out, and that can make it not so fun to face failures. But maybe I'll throw it to you first, Che. What do you think is this mental roadblock that people have, not wanting to measure failure?
I think it's, by and large, I don't think there's too much aversion to measure failure, because they are measuring failure in other ways, right? It's just less precise ways, less effective ways. But what can happen with this sort of experimentation thing is it's not just the decision to run an A/B test; it's also the nature in which you build. Where if you are building in a way that's sort of waterfall-y, so everyone who doesn't know that term, it's you basically pre-commit to build this very long thing with multiple steps, and it's after you spent 6 months and a ton of resources, the idea of just doing this analysis and having it fail, it just puts a huge amount of embarrassment, right? Because now that there's a large resource expenditure that failed. And so there can be this sort of comfort that look, if you just don't use precise measurements and you just kind of use some sort of engagement metrics, which are not connected to the bottom line, you can kind of create this sort of smoke around what you're doing that makes everyone feel good. And so that's basically what happens. And so if you want to start running experiments, there's actually a set of ways you should operationally adjust, which is to not take such large investments, try to build things that are a bit smaller, be a bit more humble and say if it's actually the case that you're going to fail 2/3 of the time, you're definitely going to have to take enough shots on goal to actually get something worth iterating on. So, usually when I talk to teams who are getting started experimenting, the first impulse is to just say, first hit a quantity of experiments, just get to like a certain number of them, and that will naturally mean given your limited resources that each experiment's only going to be able to take a week or a month or so to build.
Yeah. I think even though, with look at the number of experiments you're running, something I hear a lot from teams that are newer to experimentation is like almost a fixation on the win rate of experiments. I especially see this true, in my background, working with marketing teams, right? They are very oriented on running experiments to drive growth in certain marketing metrics, and they see, failed experiments maybe as wasted effort, or just, experiments that weren't planned out well enough in advance. And they, the thing that they're trying to improve on a meta level is their win rate. But I wonder if there's a bit of a trap there. And Sven, maybe as the resident statistician, you would be best poised to speak to this. But is win rate a good thing to be considering if you're an experimentation team, or is it misleading?
Personally, I think win rate is in some sense, taking it a little bit technically, is a ratio metric, right? And all ratio metrics have an issue that you can make the win rate go up by making the numerator bigger, but also sometimes the denominator smaller, right? And I think that's the problem with win rate as a metric. I think, as Che alluded to, when you start adopting experimentation to power innovation, you have to change the process in which you innovate, right? You cannot build a really large project and then after half a year or a year run a single experiment and hope that it wins, because it's unlikely, or it's fairly likely that it doesn't, right? And so you have to change that process. And so really what it's all about is throwing as much mud at the wall as you can, right? Rather than and see what sticks. And so win rate has the tendency to try and focus on small ideas that are kind of shoo-ins, not go out there and try very risky things because they might hurt your win rate. But we also know that the returns on experimentations, right? Like, first of all, it's hard to predict whether something is positive or negative. The other thing we know about it is that the tails of the outcomes, right? Like if you look at the distribution of outcomes, the tails are heavy, which is to say there is a pretty large probability that the outcome is very positive or very negative, even for small changes. And so to make the most of that, you want to test a lot. And I think win rate isn't great at incentivizing that.
Yeah. Well, and incentives are kind of a classic problem here. I think so. An example that we bring up a lot internally is if engineers are measured in their job performance on the number of lines of code that they ship, then they're not going to want to run experiments, because experiments are going to tell them not to ship a bunch of the code that they had written. So, I mean, Che, you lead a company. How do you incentivize people properly to take risks?
Yeah, I think in a way, I feel like the thing about win rate and taking risks is like in the end, everyone just wants wins. Just like raw wins, and just how do you get there? And so, as someone who runs a company, the main thing I want to do is maximize wins, which means, taking a lot of bets, trying to make the bets as, good as possible within reason, and just kind of de-risking your ability to get to the end and just have enough wins. So I've seen enough, companies and exploitation programs where the most common failure pattern is an inability to ship, an inability to try enough things. And so I kind of over-index on that quite a lot. Is like, if you can just get enough ideas deployed, there tend to be some winners in there.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that recognition of outcomes is a pretty important part of that equation too. And it would be good to have both of you answer this question. Maybe Che, you can go first, and then Sven. But in your past teams and companies, like, how did you make sure that there was visibility across the org for experiment outcomes, that learnings were shared out, wins were celebrated, learnings were documented?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, at Airbnb, we put a lot of premium on this, right? We literally built a big knowledge management system called the Knowledge Repo, which I was involved in. And among the different experimentation platforms that exist in things, I think one of the things Airbnb over-indexed on, to its credit, was having very, very standardized reporting, so that it's very easy to kind of drop in on and view any experiment from any corner of the building. And like, the top line business KPIs are the same across all of them, and you can kind of put them in conversation with some other groups' experiments and get a flavor for it. So, just having that built up muscle to like just get an experiment report in front of you and to believe it's correct and kind of understand how to read it, really helps you then celebrate the wins when they happen. And then, once you see a win happens, then it's around a bit more of the storytelling around it, which is like, why did it win? Why did it not? What can we take away from this? A lot of this is segment level understanding. If you just cut up your population into kind of power users, casual users, new users, experienced users by countries, whatever, you're going to notice some trends of like where do you see a lot of sensitivity of like a certain segment really cares about a certain thing. And like usually, if you think through like at the core of this experiment, what exactly were we showing? Like there might be something to mind that leads you to more ideas.
Sven, what was your experience at Stitch Fix with this?
Yeah, I think the experience at Stitch Fix, especially on the algorithms team, is quite different. And I think partially that is because on the algorithms team at Stitch Fix, at least, we had a lot of folks with a PhD from STEM fields that were naturally very research inclined, right? So all of these people were very interested in kind of understanding the mechanisms, the dynamics. So I think there was just a lot of curiosity. I think that the team that was built at Stitch Fix really fostered that curiosity, and everyone was always excited to learn from everyone. So it wasn't so much about standardized reporting. We did do a lot of sharing of results, but often in presentations, sometimes long, sometimes very short. One of my favorite rituals at the algorithms team at Stitch Fix, and I think this works pretty well, although it doesn't just apply to experimentation, was Bev Minute, where there was an hour every Thursday where everyone on the team initially, later the team became too big, but initially everyone on the team had 1 minute to present on what they did that week to get a sense of what everyone was doing. And I think that kind of level of sharing, and that generated a lot of discussion and cross-pollination. And not just about experimentation results, but just about work in general, I think really helps create this kind of scientific and curiosity-driven mindset. I think that works very well with experimentation. It might not work at every company, but I think that way the algorithms team at Stitch Fix quite unique.
Yeah. On the other side of what we did at Airbnb that I think is another layer of it is, when you talk about celebrating, there's both like sharing out of results and making it, known what just happened, what you learned. The other side is it actually built into the operating model, like the literal kind of as the FP&A team, started breaking down the year and talking about things. Like if you logged a successful experiment, we would do this extrapolation process of, first figuring out what does this experiment mean for the whole Airbnb ecosystem. So if you're experimenting only on mobile, what is the top line impact of the thing? If you extrapolate the top line impact to the rest of the year, what does that mean in terms of incremental bookings you achieved? And then, even though we didn't have the right math at the time, we did take a haircut on it. It was kind of known as like, yeah, there's something, we can't quite trust all the numbers here, so why don't we just like cut it in half or something like that? Basically just let's try to be conservative and just say like, imagine it's half the impact. And then that would all be kind of written into like, what did this team build into the bottom line of Airbnb?
Yeah. And I'll just emphasize the point here. I think like internal marketing of the experimentation program is really important, because I think if one team is experimenting in a silo and maybe other teams aren't, there's actually a lot of danger in that. I can't name names here for obvious reasons, but there's a company I consulted with in the past where one team was running experiments that were positively impacting the metrics that they owned and were measured on, but were detrimental to the metrics that other teams owned, like maybe latency for an engineering team, or in a two-sided marketplace, they were prioritizing the seller experience over the buyer experience. So if one team's running experiments and other teams haven't bought in yet, and there isn't that, a lot of effort placed on evangelism and sharing out and getting teams unified, you can have detrimental impact on the top line of the business at the end of the day. You can't just run experiments and then move on. It's important not only for the business, but your career growth, the growth of the experimentation culture, put a lot of effort into figuring out the right way to share these things and get folks to listen. It was cool to see too. Both of you were visiting some Eppo customers in Europe over the last few years, and they ran some experimentation days at these companies where it was like a day-long symposium to get together a bunch of different teams from across the company and show off some of what experimentation pods were working on. Guess any takeaways from those that listeners might be able to incorporate at their own companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we went to a few of our customers at Zalando and Delivery Hero. And, these are companies that run quite a lot of experiments in a lot of different parts of the business. They put on these experimentation days where, it was about the infrastructure, it was around the experiments themselves. It was around everything that had to do with operating with an experimental mindset. And it was very effective. In a way, the audience of those things is somewhat leadership and teams that are on the fence of running experiments. So, they basically making the case that one, experiments are easy to run due to infra investments we've made, but two is just in a way, what is an experiment? What is this process of setting a hypothesis and testing it and learning from it? Like, you just kind of walk through the whole story of how it happened. And what I thought was so interesting about how they did it is, when you're running experiments, it runs the gamut, right? There's a set of things which are sort of like kitchen table, simple experiments of like, I just want to change one UX element to another, try it positioned different ways, 3 cards versus 2 cards on the screen. And it's stuff where like you're essentially optimizing. Like, there is metric improvement, but it's not really something that is going to echo around the walls of the company with the amount of innovation you did. Instead, they chose the experiments to present that told kind of an interesting story of innovation. Something that was strategically important, where it's like, the biggest issue at our company is margin and commission rates, and that's generally negotiated. So we're going to run some experiments to kind of help answer some questions that guide those negotiations. Or, our biggest issue is kind of international growth, and here's a set of tests we tried, and here's what worked on international growth. And so just kind of being able to storytell around not just the experiments you ran, but why they tie to kind of important areas of strategic innovation, really did a lot. I think it's what's cool about it is like you're essentially telling an innovation story, except you're coming with receipts. You're coming with like a real sense of like, this stuff is proven, this stuff is true, and you can dive into it deeper if you want. Understand it by segments. Understand it by season. You can rerun it if you want. It involves so much more that you can take away and learn. So when you do those sorts of things where like, here's a story of innovation, it applies to a top-level company concern. We understand it deeply, not just its aggregate impact, but its segment-level impact. That's like very easy for leadership to buy into. Very easy.
Yeah. Maybe before we pivot away from the topic of avoiding silos, there's another type of silo that can occur besides like a cross-departmental one, and that's a silo between technical stakeholders or team members who maybe understand like what's going on under the hood in experimentation, and non-technical team members who maybe don't know what a p-value is or a confidence interval, and they want to use experiments to make decisions, but they're new to the practice and maybe new to some of the terminology and technique. So Sven, I think you're very good at like making some of these concepts approachable for new folks. I'm curious what advice you would have to, maybe someone with a similar background to yourself understands the math and the epistemology behind experiments, but is trying to, put up a big tent and invite new folks into the fold. Like, how would you help make experimentation more approachable?
Yeah, I think one thing we can do, and this is inspired by my academic advisor, Ramesh Johari, who did this at Optimizely when they introduced the sequential testing approach there. One thing he said, the problem that he saw there, and I think is kind of true more generally, is that we often try to bring the people to the statistics rather than the statistics to the people. And so, we try to have people understand p-values rather than saying, what are the statistics that people actually understand, right? So I think that shift in mindset is super interesting. Like, don't make people go through complicated hoops that they might not be too interested in, right? Like, they probably didn't they decided not to become a data scientist, right, or not to get a PhD in statistics. So think about what are the problems they're actually trying to solve and bring solutions to them that solve the problems, right? I think a super simple example, I mean, you mentioned that both p-values and confidence intervals are maybe hard to interpret, but I would argue confidence intervals, for example, are easier to interpret than p-values. Might still be some difficulty, but I think intuitively a little bit easier to grasp, right? So if you have the choice about do you report a p-value or a confidence interval, right? Report the confidence interval rather than the p-value, right? And so I think those are the things to think about, right? Like, how do you make things accessible and how do you bring the statistics to the people rather than the other way around?
Cool. I want to pivot the conversation slightly to the land of process and technical considerations in scaling experimentation, because I think that's one of the things that makes experimentation so tough to get to a very mature level, is that the challenges that you face along the way always seem to alternate between cultural ones and technical ones. Okay, we've got some people interested in running experiments, but now how do we go beyond our initial experimentation use cases and build the right processes and tooling to make it more pervasive? And then how do we get more people bought in, or how do we get more investment for our program? And then it's back to a process or technical question all over again. So maybe we can take the conversation in that direction and think about someone who's, maybe, running, I don't know, tens of experiments a year or a few dozen, and they're interested in taking it to that next level of scale. What are the challenges that they're going to face now on a process front? They've got some buy-in, they've run the first couple tests, but maybe they didn't think about the long game when they were first starting out. What are they going to face now? And Che, maybe I'll have you answer that first.
Yeah, I think the big thing is if you are only running tens of experiments to start, then you have to understand why is that, and there's a phrase that Sven says, which I have used all the time, which is basically you're either kind of idea constraints or data constraints, when doing this. Either you don't have enough ideas to test, or you don't have enough traffic to kind of deal with it and test more. Now, the unfortunate thing is that a lot of companies are actually even infra constrained as well, where they're bottlenecked on the literal process of running an experiment, which is, thankfully due to companies like Epo, becoming increasingly solved. You don't. It's not something you have to face. But suppose you do have some infrastructure that lets you essentially, seamlessly run tests. From a process execution standpoint, just make it very seamless and fast and not an issue. Then the question is just going to be, you're running these tens of experiments, is it because each one takes so long you don't have enough traffic? Or in which case you need to kind of make sure you're running kind of as strategic of experiments as you can, or, be comfortable with more underpowered tests? Or you need to come up with more ideas and deploy them more. I think people kind of underestimate how the breadth of ideas that you could deploy. If you scope them down, made them small bets, and that kind of leads to probably the fastest path to getting into the sort of hundreds, thousands of experiments to run. And I guess the other thing as well is that another easy path to becoming much more experimental is to just get more teams bought in. So many companies start off with just say a growth team or an AI team as the initial experimenters, because those workflows are kind of inherently experimental. It's very stochastic AI models to figure out what's going to outperform others. It's hard to measure them in aggregate because they're probabilistic stochastic. So you kind of need the A/B test aggregate measurement to understand them. In growth teams, they are basically claiming we're going to improve a metric, and we're going to do it through ways that might seem unremarkable or simple or whatever, but we're going to improve a metric. And so they also need these sorts of proven, tried and true ways. But once and those two teams should get you to tens of experiments a year, probably more. But once you go beyond that, you start to realize, every single product launch is essentially an experiment. I think there's a Sean Taylor phrase I love, which is everyone's experimenting, only some people are measuring. And you start to bring that attitude to more things, where it's all these actions you're taking, all these investments of resources, do you actually understand them? Do you actually understand what moved the needle, what didn't? Because it's pretty much guaranteed that 2/3 of them did not move the needle. So, as you kind of create winners on growth and AI teams, or whatever the early proto experiment teams are, aim to kind of evangelize and get more people into that way of thinking.
Yeah.
I think one important thing to call out here, right, is if you want to, when you start experimenting, that often is driven by a data leader and a data science organization. But if you want to scale that to tens and hundreds and thousands of experiments, there has to be some sort of shift where you can't have a data scientist be involved in every single experiment, right? Because then you just end up having to hire so many data scientists. So you totally want to start out, right, having a data science led experimentation program, but the key switch that needs to happen to really scale experimentation is that you need other people to really be able to run experiments with less and less help and intervention of data scientists, right? Because otherwise you will always remain constrained. And I think a lot of organizations get stuck because experimentation doesn't expand beyond, this data science led process.
Yeah. When I think about scaling or systemizing, one word that pops into my head a lot is standardization. It feels pretty necessary once you get past like a certain point of scale, and I think it's what you're touching on here, Sven, as well. Che, you mentioned early in the conversation the idea of standardizing, like the reporting out of experiments. I'm curious, where are the other opportunities for standardization in the experimentation lifecycle that teams should be looking to take advantage of as they're making these stage leaps from tens to hundreds to thousands?
Yeah. So, if you're trying to take these stage leaps, that there's a couple ways to think about it. So, one is to increase the demand to run experiments, which is about this evangelization stuff we're talking about. How do you, like, as teams are experimenting, how do you turn them into, winning teams? They are delivering wins. They are shipping fast. They are acting as operational experts. They are a paragon of how you operate. If these people kind of demonstrate this sort of value and they're rewarded, promoted, and they evangelize the results, there's naturally going to be a sense of gravity to operate like them. So, the good news is that if you, run experiments, you naturally start to look like that. And, if you just kind of get through the frictions on the way. So, first thing is how do you just increase the demand for it? And, standardization is already a big part there, because if you want more and more people to understand the experiments, they can't have to reorient themselves around some new report every time, some new metrics every time. And, this gets into the next stage, which is the friction, like reducing friction of running experiments. So we already talked about how do you increase demand. Now, the other part is how do you reduce the friction of running experiments? That's where, again, tooling really, really helps here, where, ideally, if you have an idea that you think could improve the bottom line, there should be a very little that you have to learn that is experiment specific to test that idea. You shouldn't have to learn like what metrics to use or what's the right definition of them. You shouldn't have to learn, like what statistics regime should I use, or, here's this kind of like very kind of undocumented, hard to parse SDK for setting it up. Like the whole thing needs to be quite smooth, approachable, and easy so that you can kind of live in ideas land and get excited about that without having a bunch of friction for actually running the experiment itself. And that's, again, where standardization comes into play, where all the processes of running experiments, the infrastructure of it, can become highly standardized. It turns out everyone should use the same definition of revenue. It turns out every experiment of a certain type should use these 4 metrics for making a decision and kind of use them in this sort of order. It turns out everyone setting up experiments in this part of the system should use the same similar structure for the SDK use. So, the heavy amount of standardization means that it's going to be kind of well-documented, low friction, easy to absorb, easy to learn. So, if you're trying to grow from 10 to 100 to 1,000 experiments at a time, you got to increase the demand via kind of creating more moments of celebration, creating more winners, some, a greater sense that these people operate well, and to decrease the friction, the sort of risk of being an operational failure by creating better standardization, streamlined, highly reliable workflows.
Yeah. I can't help but steer us into the technical for a second, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks listening to this who will appreciate it. But Sven, my version of this question for you is, if we think about like the actual design of experiments and statistical plans, I'm curious to get your take if there are elements that are appropriate to standardize across an organization or at least across a team, or are there elements that are very much not appropriate to standardize and we should reconsider on an experiment by experiment basis? Curious where you land.
That's a good question. I think we should default probably to standardizing, because the first goal should be to make experimentation as easy as possible. Now, And the more you standardize, right, also the more or the less data science has to be involved and the more time data scientists have to really go into the edge cases, right? Because every company has unique situations that require really expertise to solve particular problems, right? Whether that's, experimenting on a marketplace or other types of constraints that make it difficult to do the standard analysis. So I think, first of all, you want to standardize as much as possible to also free up time and space for your experts to really work on the hard problems. I think you want to, I think the two things, right, to standardize is really, first of all, I think you want to make all decisions where people will have to think, ideally as easy as possible, right? Like, how long should I run this experiment, right? You don't want everyone to run a power analysis. That takes a lot of time. And quite frankly, I think in a lot of cases, you can just know from kind of historical experiments that, an experiment on this particular feature generally takes a month, right? Like, let's default to a month for these things, or 2 weeks, right? Because every historical experiment, if you run it for that long, works well. So take those uncertainties and those decisions away and standardize them. I think the other thing that really helps, and I think we haven't really talked about, and this is particularly important if you want to have more people adopt experimentation, is to make it less risky. And in particular, right, you launch this new feature, you don't want to bring the site down, right? You want to make sure that you don't ship something buggy. And it's quite often the case, right? You start an experiment and you realize, oh, something is wrong. We have to restart this. So have standard protocols to do this, right? Roll out slowly, know what you have to monitor early on, right? Like, this is the dashboard we track for latency and errors and make sure that this looks good. And if it does, increase traffic. And if it doesn't look good, right, stop. Like, make people comfortable by making it less scary and less risky. I think there's another big opportunity to really make people feel more comfortable to start experimenting, right? Because no one wants to email leadership that they brought the site down.
No, definitely not, and especially not on a Friday.
Yeah.
Right.
Worst of all.
Yeah, I think it's also a place that kind of varies by discipline. I think within product experimentation, the A/B test within product, I tend to be a little bit more maximalist, where I'm like, I really don't think non-standard testing is that much of a thing, and that there's just a lot more standardization that is generally required. You can have a few buckets of them, like growth experiments should generally follow a different thing than pricing experiments, which might go different than AI experiments. You can have some sort of prototypes that are, kind of standardized within the type. But by and large, I think most experiments should be pretty standard. The exceptions would be just, this is a new area we've never tested on it before. And so we just have to understand some new things around it. So outside of like the forays into a never done before thing, I think by and large, most things are quite repeatable. The interesting thing will be, though, is like as you get into marketing experiments, omni-channel experiments, once you are syncing up the rollout of a product with the, marketing campaign around the product, that's where there's like a bit more details around like how exactly do you want, this setup to go, because you're crossing more systems. But, even with those, like kind of in principle, it's really about the principle is the same, that you are taking random groups and, delivering something novel to one and not to the other. And you want to keep that somewhat straight. But again, depending on kind of other constraints around, when you get into ad testing lands, there are certain seasons, certain units, certain entities that are a bit more touchy that that leadership does not feel comfortable experimenting on. There again, you might get something slightly non-standard. But when it comes to the A/B test, the product A/B test, I think by and large standardization is, 99% of people have less standardization than they should.
Yeah. Well, I have no doubt that this is the first of many, many conversations we will have on building cultures of experimentations at companies, because that is the toughest part of the job. But I think we can summarize it really using the framework that you introduced, Che, right? It comes down to two tasks: increasing demand for experiments and reducing friction of running experiments. When we talk about increasing demand, we talked about evangelizing all the experiments that are run across the organization, whether that's a minute at a time or in a full day experimentation day, symposium, celebrating successes when we find those wins, making sure that more broadly we're aligned on a strategy of shipping iteratively and not doing this very, long-term waterfall approach to development. And then the flip side is reducing friction with standardization and protocols, with the right tooling so that data science doesn't have to be involved in every single experiment as you make that jump from tens to hundreds. And Sven, to quote you, quoting Ramesh, bring the statistics to the people as opposed to the people to the statistics. I think if any aspiring experimentation leader, took a handful of those ideas and just oriented around those two goals of increasing demand, reducing friction, make a lot of headway in starting up that culture of experimentation from the grassroots. Any parting thoughts or advice for folks who are looking to do this in their orgs from either of you?
I think one thing that I took away from Stitch Fix, again, which was this very curiosity-driven organization, and I think was very successful, is that leadership has to be bought into experimentation. There has to be a top-down approach that really encourages a kind of bottoms-up idea of experimentation, where everyone is allowed to experiment, right? It has to come from leadership to make that clear. If that buy-in isn't there from leadership, it's very hard. But they should really promote a bottoms-up culture and really incentivize everyone to run experiments. One anecdote, if I may, that I really liked from my time at Stitch Fix to illustrate that is that Brad Klingenberg, one of the leaders of the algorithms team, would often email you in the morning when you ran an experiment and be like, hey, Sven or whoever else on the team, I was just looking at your experiment and I ran this little SQL query, which is not very standardized, but this is what Brad would do. And there seems to be something interesting going on here. Like, have you looked into that? And I think that's the kind of enthusiasm and that really encourages everyone to experiment. And it also makes it very vivid, right? That leadership cares and that they are engaging with the process. So I would highly encourage leadership to really get involved and show your interest. And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's such a fun contrast with my time at Airbnb, right? Because leadership has had a very different relationship with A/B testing over the years. The advice I would give to most companies is kind of coming out of the stories at Airbnb, where Brian Chesky, he's actually very experimental in the way entrepreneurs are, but he, like many others, tends to lean on kind of design and qual as a way of kind of really gaining confidence in a product. But the advice I would give to most people is that you don't have to boil the ocean right away. You don't have to win over the whole company or everyone everywhere. You just have to win over one team that wants to start acting experimentally and make them successful. And so, some of the stuff we talked about here, which is around one, making sure that the process of running an experiment is very smooth, easy, reliable. You're not going to fail purely out of your experiment execution. And there really are tools that can give you that sense of confidence, like EPO. And two, just making sure that you avoid some of the anti-patterns, the failure patterns, which is to do big waterfall style building even while trying to act as an experimental team. Instead you need to be very lightweight, run a lot of experiments, aim for quantity over kind of heavy investment. And then once they're kind of there's a lot of a build it and they will come that applies to experimentation culture. Win over one pod, then win over another, then win over another team, and eventually you just get this big mass that is all kind of seen as a great operating team.
Yeah. I think that's a common story in a lot of, tech giant companies. I think it's very rare that an executive snapped their fingers and everyone was experimental right away. I think that, finding a beachhead and building success there is a pretty common pattern. But I thank you both for, sharing so many anecdotes during this conversation, because like I said in the intro, it's hard to generalize advice for this stuff. And I think so much learning about how to build a culture of experimentation or figuring out what to try comes from those anecdotes from folks that have actually been in the trenches and led the charge on this. So trusting that folks will walk away from this conversation with plenty of things to try actioning on. Thanks for listening to this episode of Outperform. If you enjoyed the discussion and want more content about using experimentation to drive innovation and growth in your company, visit getepo.com/outperform. Your journey towards building a winning company and career starts here. Until next time, keep experimenting.